We start this lesson by reflecting on what this generation of Israelites had seen over 2 years. You see, they looked upon Moses as he confronted Pharaoh and witnessed the plagues that God brought upon Egypt. They stood before the Red Sea, trapped by Pharaoh's army as they approached from the rear, and saw God part that Red Sea and send the sea crashing down upon the Egyptian army. They saw and heard the evidence of God's majestic presence on Mount Sinai. In fact, the Israelites lived in the Sinai wilderness, where God provided food and water for the multitude, including their cattle. They experienced God's guidance and protection, but they also witnessed God's wrath. But throughout their entire journey, Israel grumbled. Some even longed for the days of bondage in Egypt. Last week we talked about the 12 spies that were sent into Canaan, the promised land. Only 2, Caleb and Joshua, let their faith in the power of Israel's God inform their judgment. With this 10-2 report, Israel, who had previously departed from God by worshiping idols, they demonstrated their lack of faith in God's leadership and in the leadership of his messenger, Moses. As for Joshua, Aaron, and Caleb, none of them had the trust and confidence of the people either. Israel expressed so much fear and lack of faith in God that they not only refused to enter the promised land and engage in the battle, but they plotted to kill their leaders. Moses, Joshua, Aaron, and Caleb all had their critics from amongst their own people. Martin Luther King, as he led the civil rights movement, had critics within the civil rights movement. It takes courage to do the right thing, even though you may sometimes be facing contrary public opinion. This coup would have been executed, but God stepped in, showing his glory and asking, "How long will these people treat me like dirt? How long will they refuse to trust me?" With all that God had done for Israel, there was no excuse for a lack of faith. At this point, God is angry. This is more than just raw anger. God had plans to send a plague and kill Israel. God presents Moses with the same test that he has given him before, right after the golden calf incident. "I will smite them with pestilence and dispose of them," he said then. Moses responds here in the same way that he responded to an angry God then. Moses asks for God's glory to be shown, saying, "The Egyptians are going to hear about this. If you kill the entirety of the people in one stroke, all the nations that have heard of your power and your protection will say, since God could not get them into the land that he had promised them, he slaughtered them outside in the wilderness." Moses, just as he did before, appeals to God in accordance with his character and God's covenant. Moses knew, and modern Christians should recognize, that God is predictable in terms of his character, because God is unchanging. You see in this text that Moses does not seek to make excuses for the children of Israel. Rather, Moses appeals to God and his enduring character and grace of God, saying, "Show us the grace like you have all along in this journey." Now, notice the exact wording here. Moses pleads for God to show his strength. After Egypt, it is obvious to Moses that God's ability to smite and remove the sinful and the enemies of Israel is unchallenged. His appeal for strength is really an appeal, a prayer for God to have the power to restrain his anger and his desire to smite Israel. Just because we have the power and the urge to do an act does not mean we should exercise that power. Sometimes God expects the stronger person, the more mature Christian, to rise above the urges to use that power and authority, and with a spiritual strength, restrain our actions. Moses appeals to an unchanging God, pleading, Show us a God that is slow to anger with a great unconditional love. Show us a God who forgives even though his people are filled with iniquity, rebellion, and sin. Moses pleads, show us a God that, while not overlooking the sin, recognizing that there are consequences to sin, like the unconditional love of a parent, gives us another chance. Similar to what I once did for clients, Moses is plea bargaining for Israel to get a less severe punishment, pleading for God to forgive them for their wrongdoings, not only forgive them now, but forgive them from the time they left Egypt. Since God is unchanging, God is also predictable. He kept his covenant to Israel. God's love and restraint, even in the face of justifiable anger, shows modern Christians our need to seek to forgive those contrite people, even when the world would say we have the right to take righteous action. As expected, God forgave Israel. Forgiveness meant that God would not instantly destroy Israel on the spot, as he threatened. It didn't mean that Israel would escape the consequences of their sin. Even for us, forgiveness means that we must have the strength to flex our spiritual muscle and restrain ourselves, and remember that vengeance belongs to the Lord and not us. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week. Bye.